Okay. It's my honor to introduce Representative Chellie Pingree, who is a congresswoman from Maine's 1st Congressional District. In 1993, she was elected to the Maine Senate, and in 2008, she was elected to Congress, the first woman to be elected from her district. In Congress, she wrote the Local Farms, Food, and Jobs Act, a comprehensive package of reforms to agricultural policy to expand opportunities for local and regional farmers. Many of the provisions of her bill were included in the 2014 Farm Bill. Congresswoman Pingree is a farm and small business owner. In 2014, Food and Wine and Fortune magazines listed her as number 2 on the list of most innovative women in food and drink. Please join us in welcoming Congresswoman Pingree.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to everyone here today, for all of you for having me join you, and thank you for interrupting your lunch to listen to me speak. What a wonderful lunch and a great gathering. I've been fortunate enough to be here since this morning, and really been interested to hear the other panels. Thank all of you for all the things you're imparting, and hopefully we can have a dialogue in the future about some of the ways we are interested in the same issues. I have to, unfortunately, leave after I talk, so I won't get to hear the afternoon speakers, but I just wanted to point out I have 2 people who've been working with me here. This is Brooke and Lee, sitting next to each other there. Brooke worked is on my staff doing agricultural policy. She was at the USDA for 4 years before she came to work with us, so she's a great resource and very helpful. And Lee has been our Sea Grant Fellow for the past year, working on environmental and marine kinds of issues and agriculture a little bit as well. So if I don't get to make a connection with any of you and you want to follow up on some of these topics, please make the contact through them. And again, thank you to all the organizers for putting this together and allowing me to participate. But let me just dive in and then tell you a few things that are on my mind, and perhaps we can have a few questions and a little bit of a dialogue after that. I represent the 1st Congressional District of Maine. This is my 4th term in office, but I never really anticipated a life in politics. And full disclosure, I'm not a lawyer. I get to make those laws. But I don't really have any kind of background in the law. In fact, my only qualification for being a member of Congress or any kind of elected official is as an organic farmer. I moved to Maine. I'm a Minnesotan at heart. But I moved to Maine right after high school, and it was 1971, long before many of you were born, but I came with a book that many people were interested in at the time called Living the Good Life by Helen and Scott Nearing, who were some of the original sort of sustainable agriculture, back to the land, sort of gurus at the time, no longer alive. And I moved to a tiny little island an hour off the coast of Maine, which is still my home, and I've been there now for more than 40 years. Although I was from a dairying family in Minnesota, I knew virtually nothing about farming, and this book in some ways was my guide. But I turned to a lot of the older farmers on the island, people who had been in it before, and many others who were just getting their start in kind of the organic farming movement. I had my own farm for many years, raising 3 dairy cows, 100 chickens, a couple of acres of vegetables, got into the wool business. I've done a variety of things along the way. I never anticipated being in politics, but having 3 children, I got on the local school board. I wanted to be more engaged in public policy, and one day somebody came up to me at a farm stand that I was running and said, we're looking for a candidate for the state senate in this district. Why don't you think about running? It was the furthest thing ever from my mind, and only later did I realize that I lived in a Republican district and I was their Democratic sacrificial lamb. But surprisingly, in 1992, the year of the woman, I won, and I've been working in politics on and off ever since. Maine has a term limit, so I only served in the Maine legislature for 8 years, but interestingly to all of you, my daughter followed me into office and served for 8 years in the Maine legislature and was the youngest female Speaker of the House ever in the state of Maine, so never think that you're too young to go into politics. When I first got into organic farming, it was clearly on the fringe. It wasn't something that people were talking about in the ways we're talking about today or had so much interest. That was the era of Richard Nixon and his Secretary of Agriculture saying, get big or get out. We were growing farms into bigger and bigger conglomerates. We weren't moving towards more family farms. Organic agriculture was certainly not mainstream, and people who were interested in the things I was doing were much more considered sort of hippie, back to the land, Birkenstock, granola, just a fringe kind of movement in our country, but nothing that was ever going to become part of the mainstream of life. I wanted to go to an agricultural school for college, and there were no sustainable programs in Maine or pretty much anywhere else, and I was lucky enough to go to College of the Atlantic, where Elliot Coleman was one of my mentors, and he has continued to be one of the leaders in the organic farming movement, and imparted a lot of great information to all of us. I'm still an organic farmer. I've gone back into the business in the last decade, so I now run an organic farm, and I also own an inn and a restaurant, which is why I'm still in business. And I grow a lot of the food for my own restaurant. It also gives me an amazing opportunity to sort of have firsthand knowledge on some of these public policy decisions that we have to make, and be able to come into the room and remind people that sometimes on the weekends I eviscerate chickens, so don't mess with me. When I was in the legislature 20 years ago, it was also a long way from some of the public policy we were talking about today. We were just discussing, in some small ways, genetically modified seeds or irradiated foods, bovine growth hormone, but still, those were very hard issues to move forward on. Most people on the Agriculture Committee had a very different perspective. So fast forward 40 years from 1971, and here we all are today. And I can honestly say, and I think everyone here can concur, and we've heard a lot of great conversations this morning about how young people are interested in this topic, people through all demographics, and the world is really changing in terms of what kind of food people want to put on the table and what kind of policy they want to work on and discuss. One of my favorite statistics that I tell people when I go through the whole laundry list of things that have really changed is the Organic Trade Association had a briefing for us a while ago, and one of their slides said that 9 out of 10 parents who choose to buy baby food for their kids buy organic baby food. So if you think about that, that cuts through all demographics. That doesn't mean you're particularly wealthy. That doesn't mean anything else. It just means that this generation is saying, I want to make sure I give my kids a healthy start, and that's how I perceive I should do it. In my own state of Maine, which was once a very important agricultural state, people like to say that Maine fed the Union Army. Sorry about the Union Army. I'm in the South. But we diminished our agricultural capacity for a long time because of competition with the big agricultural states out west. But that is totally turning itself around. We have an increase in the number of farms under cultivation now. The numbers are going up. The average age of our farmers is going way down, and the number of women in farming is going way up. So there's this whole young population that is getting engaged in farming from a whole different perspective of innovation and value added, looking at things, I think, in a very different way than many of our traditional farmers did. Sales of organic in this country have increased by almost 50% in 5 years, and again, you're seeing it everywhere. The big corporations, they want to have a piece of organic or sustainable or all these labels that we might need, but they know that their consumers want to see a very different product. So you're seeing a lot of big corporations trying to buy little companies that have been innovative because they want to make sure they add it to their product line. All those things just say to me, we are in the right place at the right time discussing this. Now we just have to talk about the enormous obstacles in front of us in terms of really making policy change. This is one of those places where the market demand, consumer demand is really bumping up against public policy. Again, the fastest growing part of retail sales today is in organic and locally grown food in all grocery stores. Walmart wants to be the biggest retailer of organic food in the country because they see the potential for the demand, and certainly locally sourcing at restaurants is the hottest trend for the last 5 years, according to the National Restaurant Association. So consumers are saying, where's my food? How can I find out more about what's in my food? And unfortunately, in many, many ways, government policy is still stuck in that get bigger, get out era. I don't think the tension is all bad. This is what creates change. Often it's the pressure from the outside or in the marketplace that forces my colleagues or members in policy-making decisions to actually make change, and I think that is what will get us to that tipping point. I have been in Congress for 6 years. I thought when I got there that I would have a chance to work on food and farming policy, and I thought, like so many issues in Congress, I've been involved in healthcare and environmental issues and everything else. I thought, well, I'll get in line, I'll wait for seniority, and then I'll take on talking about this issue. And I was very surprised to find that I didn't have a lot of colleagues. There's some great people working on some of these issues there, but there weren't a lot of people kind of grasping onto this and saying, hey, our constituents really want us to do this. Why aren't we talking more about it? So I've been very fortunate to work on parts of the Farm Bill, I wrote a provision called the Local Food Farms and Jobs Act, and while that wasn't, obviously implemented in whole, we were able to insert many, many pieces into the Farm Bill, and I thank Sarah for mentioning almost all of them for me and giving you a much greater description of them all, but these were things that we had supported, and whether they were the Double Bucks program, giving more people to spend on their SNAP benefits if they bought fresh fruit and vegetables, more support for organic farms, organic conversion, more organic research, crop insurance. It's more beneficial to diversified farms, not just single commodities. We have a list of things that we did, and many of them I did with the support of Republican colleagues. I want to just make it really clear. Agriculture isn't a partisan issue necessarily. There are Democrats who I come up against and fight all the time, and there are Republicans I work with all the time. It has much more to do often with the region that you come from. Do you represent corn or peanuts or cotton or rice? What is your commodity and what are you fighting for when you get there? And that can be a very, sort of diverse cross-section of the country. But I find this has great opportunities for bipartisanship. It doesn't mean it's easy. So I just want to kind of quickly outline, nothing that will be a surprise to you, but a few of the enormous barriers to reform that we face in the light of this incredible opportunity that we have. And I really can't underestimate what a great moment in time this is. This is a very complex problem, and thank you to all the speakers who really emphasize that in so many ways, whether it's about the way we have gone about dealing with it or just the complexity of the dynamics of what goes into food policy or the Farm Bill. It's an environmental issue for us. It's an economic issue. It involves toxics in our environment, toxics in our food, our own health. There are all kinds of legal issues. There are all kinds of standard issues, food security and insecurity, the inability to feed our population or to understand how to distribute food in our country, the labor laws we bump up against, and the human cost in many of these things, getting more people access to healthy food, the difficulties of taking back a subsidy that, as you've heard, goes to the original, the beginnings of the Farm Bill and subsidizing commodities, and the difficulty of taking away the billions of dollars that are going into subsidizing big agriculture today. My goal has only been to take a little fraction of that to level the playing field and support some of the great things that are going on in many of the areas that we want to encourage. But shifting resources, even in a small way, was like pulling teeth in the Farm Bill, and we're proud of the few things we move, but in no way would we call it a document to write home about, only something that could have been worse. And we were able to move some things into that, which allowed it to look a little different. It goes without saying that when you're trying to make progress on an issue in Congress, you deal with the enormous power of the outside lobby. It is evident in the 1,200 lobbyists who work on agribusiness and food processing issues, $150 million lobbying on behalf of clients like Cargill and Monsanto. That is bigger than the defense industry, and I think of the defense industry as the powerhouse sort of lobby in Congress. So it just gives you a sense of how big that is. And for the most part, agriculture reform groups, the groups that advocate for some of the things we're talking about today, are lucky if they have one paid lobbyist. So it is very hard to create that kind of change. I mentioned earlier that one of the challenges and opportunities is this is not a partisan issue, but there still can be some partisan problems when you have the divided Congress that we have now, and even good ideas sometimes get stuck in a lockstep voting process or a majority that won't bring a creative bill to the floor, or some of the other issues that we just face structurally in Congress right now. But again, I have to say this is a good issue across the aisles in general. One issue that I feel we confront sometimes in the side of not enough people lobbying on this issue is it's many of the environmental organizations that do have a little more powerful voice in Washington and do have more communications with their constituents aren't as engaged in this issue as I think they should be. And many of you are environmentalists or interested in environmental law or might end up at one of those organizations. And given the carbon footprint of our agricultural system, whether it's from the total loss of topsoil, the loss of organic matter, to sequester the carbon in our environment that comes about with our current agricultural system, the huge use of pesticides and herbicides, the transportation of food around the country. I mean, it is one of the biggest contributors to global warming, and it should be one of the most important considerations of any environmentalist or an environmentally concerned person. But that and so many other things are frustrating at times when people don't see it as part of how do we fix the problems facing us with climate change, and I think that is starting to change, but not enough. This particular year, one of our biggest problems is that those of us who care about changing agriculture policy are in a little bit of a defensive position on a whole variety of issues that will take a lot of our time just to hold the line. We had tremendous cuts in SNAP benefits in the Farm Bill, all of which I disapproved of, but there are many people in Congress today who think we should actually cut deeper into the SNAP program, the food stamp program that assists people who are struggling to put food on the table, and the deeper those cuts are, the harder it is to give people healthy food, and we will be fighting again this year in the appropriations process not to see bigger cuts. We're going to reauthorize the child nutrition bill, and there are a lot of interests that want to roll back some of the healthier standards we put into school lunch, and that will impact our ability to get more healthy local food into school lunches, and also will be a distracting fight when we have plenty of other things that we should be working on. A little bit of a barrier that can be, in a sense, kind of an insider part of it, but I actually thought people made a lot of good points around it today, is that sometimes the helpful things we do become harmful. One of those is in the Food Safety Modernization Act, and thank you for explaining the enormous impact and the huge changes that came about or will come about because of this bill, which was a reaction to the horrendous food safety issues we have in this country and the danger people have sometimes when they go out and buy food that they expect to be healthy or feed it to their children. But I have spent a lot of the last couple of years dealing with some of the issues that will impact small farmers. My interest is, both as a small farmer and someone who's represented some of the innovative and creative farmers for virtually all my adult lifetime, many of the things that are well-intentioned are done with the thought of a 1,000-acre lettuce farm in California, and when it comes down to a 3-acre diversified market garden in a New England state, we have a whole different set of challenges for our farmers. And, asking them to test their water once a month, which is more than all of our, schools and summer camps do, or restricting the possibilities of aggregating vegetables into a CFSA if they don't all come from your farm and then you become a retail store. There's just a lot of complicated issues that I don't think anybody thought about, but the FDA is now trying to write the regulations, and it has been a big challenge for me going back to my district and trying to collect that information and then impart it to the FDA. And I have to give Michael Taylor credit. Michael Taylor is usually on the other side of someone's complaint, but he came to Maine and spent a hot August day listening to farmers from my state, and it just wasn't pretty. So I think we have a long way to go before we get to something that will satisfy everybody and not put people out of business. That is the biggest concern for me, is I don't want to get in the beginning of this, great economic rural revolution going on in my state and then suddenly be a part of creating a law that shuts all kinds of wonderful operations down just because it was a misperception about how to create food safety. So sometimes something good can really cause us some big problems. I don't know that I have to repeat, but the difficulties in not looking at this as a system and having a lot of kind of silos of either regulatory or other venues creates a lot of problems, even when we think we have a lot of people supporting change. So I have a background in human ecology, and I was lucky enough in college to both learn about organic farming, but to think about everything as an ecological system. And that's almost impossible in our current regulatory climate, which is both underfunded, milquetoasty at best in terms of they're willing to be aggressive, but also just you run up against these barriers. One that is a recent example is this approval of a new herbicide and a GMO seed combination called Enlist Duo, which is the successor to Roundup. So you probably read some things about Roundup and this next generation of it. So we had deep concerns about this because there's a new GMO seed that's Roundup resistant, and this new level of Roundup is being created because a lot of weeds and other species were decimated because of the overuse of Roundup. And if I can keep this simple, it's created super weeds. It's, by most people's assessment, been a causative factor in the elimination of milkweed. In some states like Ohio, it's basically disappeared, which has caused an enormous reduction in the amount of the monarch butterfly. Now, perhaps we could get along in life without the monarch butterfly. I don't know how kids will learn that a caterpillar becomes a butterfly, since everybody does that in 4th grade. But let's just say it's probably an indicator species, and it probably tells us a lot when the number of monarchs migrating to Mexico every year has diminished by tenfold. So there's a relationship here. But, the EPA approved the pesticide because they said, well, it doesn't seem to have any direct impacts on the environment. The USDA improved the GMO seed because they just looked at the plant pest risk. But there was nobody responsible for looking at unintended consequences, damage to the ecosystem, or what this might mean for us if the monarch butterfly disappear and what else is going wrong in terms of superweeds and everything else. So that is at the core of our inability sometimes on the regulatory front to get to the heart of the issue, and these things are getting only more complex as we've seen. So just a couple other sort of unintended consequences or challenges. One is international. As we talk more and more, and the panel made an important point about, we are now united in many ways in our food policy. We're about to potentially make decisions on big trade agreements. The president asked for this just recently, and there's a lot of concerns being raised about fast-track trade authority, but one of the, leaked possibilities in this is a proposal that would harmonize food safety and pesticide regulations between the United States and Europe. Now, the UK has a lot of standards that many of us wish we had here: labeling of GMO foods, considerations about the use of antibiotic in livestock feed, hormones in livestock feed, restrictions on the use of many other additives that are banned in most countries around the world but allowed here, and you heard a lot about the concerns some of us should have. But if there is a panel developed from a trade agreement that says we have to harmonize things, well, what if they are forced to harmonize theirs down, and we have a tougher time even introducing some of these regulations that many of us would like to see on antibiotics and hormones and other things that are not labeled and put into our food. So we have sort of an international component to this that could trump a lot of the things that we're trying to deal with at the domestic level, and it might be fast-tracked out of our control. I want to just address the issue that came up about sort of this sovereignty and regulatory authority, and it was brought up, some states have passed GMO labeling legislation. Maine is one. And Maine passed it through the legislature, and very interestingly, it was introduced by Republicans. So once again, these are not partisan issues. It was signed by our very conservative Republican governor. So again, that holds. It's tied to some other states passing it too. But, almost immediately this past year, we had a bill introduced by Mr. Pompeo, which was to cause preemption so states couldn't do this. Well, I can tell you, independent Mainers are very angry about that idea. A lot of states don't want to be told by the federal government what to do, and I know there are constant questions about the right time when the federal government can have that authority. But it certainly gets people stirred up about what if our only opportunities are in some states around the country, what if they are laboratories of democracy, and what if these kinds of possibly forward-thinking ideas are squelched by preemption at a federal level. That bill passed the House just before we left in December. The House is now in a new session this year, but I feel confident it will be reintroduced and probably come up again. My state is also one of the states that has a growing interest in the food sovereignty movement at a very, very local level. And I know Balin Lincoln is going to speak on a panel, and he's very well versed in this topic. But just to say that many municipalities in my state of Maine has over 400 small communities because we're old New England. We only have about 1.3 million people, but we got a lot of towns, and they're very small. And to our credit, we have maybe the highest percentage of voters in the country, and I think part of it is because we have this very strong town meeting system and very local engagement. But that also means people in their local communities sort of stand back and say, you're not going to tell me what to do. So we have these, increasing numbers of communities that are passing food sovereignty laws saying basically we can do whatever we want in our community and nobody can tell us what to do. Now, I have a feeling that most lawyers say that this would not hold up in any set of circumstances. But to me, they say a lot about what people are thinking about their food, and kind of to the labeling issue that you were talking about, it gives people their own ability to judge authenticity. And if that's an important criteria, and thank you for bringing that up, I have people who say to me all the time, I feel much more comfortable going down the road and looking the farmer in the eye. In fact, knowing what that farmer's, home and kitchen and backyard and farm practices are, and trusting buying a bottle of milk or a pound of tomatoes from them because I can see that food system and I feel confident about them, whereas I have no idea at the grocery store if this piece of chicken was dipped in chlorine, if it was fed hormones, or are there other toxic chemicals in my food that I know nothing about. So it is a complex kind of legal question, but I think it's very telling that so many people in small communities in my state are saying, we want to have this food sovereignty and no one's going to tell us what to do about it. So I hope I've sort of outlined for you some of the huge opportunities that we have in front of us, along with some of the challenges as I see them in the coming year. But I just want to close by one more emphasis on the importance of tackling this issue. Not only is it probably having some of the biggest environmental and health impacts of anything that happens. I mean, everybody eats, everybody has a relationship to food, and it is critically important to people across the board. I find, as someone who has to deal with a lot of hot-button political issues and controversial topics, I represent a district that's, evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats and independents. So there's no way when I go home that I have universal agreement. In fact, of a delegation of 4, I'm the only Democrat in my state. We have Democrat, Republican, and an independent. So I feel like I represent the cross-section of political thinking in America, and I'm often on the hot seat with people on a tax issue, or somebody doesn't like the Affordable Care Act, or they think global warming is bunk. But I can guarantee you, I can be in a room of 500 people, and I pause and I say, oh yeah, did I tell you that I'm on the Agriculture Appropriations Committee? And this year we're working on trying to get a little bit more money in healthy school lunches and buying more food from local farmers and supporting our sustainable and organic farmers. And the whole room just, kind of like quiets down, nods their head, shakes my hand and said, thank you, we really appreciate the work you're doing. And to me, there is nothing in politics that says more than when everybody basically agrees on an issue. And if you don't believe in my judgment, my anecdotal information, we did a little poll when I was running for office again this year, and we decided to ask a few food-related questions. So in the state of Maine, this is in Berkeley, California, we said to people, do you support increasing access to local foods? And 85% of them said yes, 1% said no, and that was 8 out of 10 Republicans. So again, I just want to emphasize, it's across the board. It's across all income levels. Maine is 30th in per capita income. We are not a wealthy state, but people will go out of their way to find a farmer's market, to eat at a local diner that sources their eggs from down the road. We actually asked them in a follow-up question, what if it cost you a little bit more to buy locally grown food or more healthy food? And 2/3 of them still said yes, and they said, I will do it because I trust this will be healthier food and I want to support the local economy. And big majorities in my state, whether they completely understand the issue or not, think GMOs should be labeled. They contact my office in droves, and people are constantly looking for a way to engage on this and do more on this. So I'll just end by saying we have a lot of work ahead of us, but I'm thrilled to be at a forum where all of you are looking closely at this topic and to see so many law professors and others who are really experts in this topic and lending their expertise to public policy change. So I'm happy to answer some questions, but thank you again very much for having me here.
Take maybe 2 questions.
Great.
In 5 minutes.
Is there a question?
One of the perceptions of the passage of the Farm Bill is that certain states with certain agricultural interests, those U.S. senators and those people in Congress, sit in a room, figure it all out, and then everybody just throws in whatever additions they want so it can get passed. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of the actual interpersonal process that might happen in terms of the passage of the Farm Bill, and so just what that process is like, and if you would like it to be more transparent, and if so, how?
Well, I think that's a very accurate assessment of how the Farm Bill gets passed. So let's not debunk any myths here. That is very true. And this year was maybe a little more complex. Congress had to go at it a couple of different times, and it was a very contentious time in Congress, which apparently is still going on. So that hasn't really changed. But a lot of the nuts and bolts get worked out by the Republican, and Democrat leaders of the committee in the House and in the Senate. And they do spend a lot of time in a closed room, and much of it has to do with what will move it through their regions or their perceived interests that they support. And a lot of it has to do with we did make a lot of changes in the commodity program this year, moved some of it into crop insurance, and you would see those guys walking out of the room into a bigger room of the committee, and they'd say, well, I think we got corn, but we don't have peanuts. It was always like that, but that said, it is such an enormous piece of legislation. I was on the agricultural committee, as I said, I moved to Agri-Propes, but there are a lot of opportunities for individual members to attempt to change language, to push for particular programs. I wrote a marker bill to include many of those things you heard talked about, but they only got included sometimes at a committee hearing when an amendment was being moved in, or through working on language with another member who was favorable towards it, or a staff. So, of course, it would be so much better if Congress was more transparent. And frankly, it would be so much better if we didn't have the pressure of the lobby always pushing on, what they want and what they're going to get. And let's face it, with that many lobbyists and that much money behind it, you got a lot of smart lawyers who are constantly slipping in language to one member or another and, making sure it gets inserted into the bill. So there's a lot of problems with the process of Congress. But again, all I can say is that, we got a few things in there, and most things we were not able to change. And, it ended up that the biggest fight in the Farm Bill was on how much we were going to cut SNAP benefits. And that's kind of a frustrating tragedy because, A, we shouldn't be doing that in the first place, but nutrition is a key part of the Farm Bill. And in fact, it's the largest amount of money in the bill. It's about 85% of the money spent in the Farm Bill. But it always comes down to that's more of an ideological partisan fight, and it shouldn't be, and it didn't used to be. So, yep.
So I'm a family resident of District 1, so first, thank you. We're happy to have you on this.
Oh, thank you.
So I have a question actually pertaining to sort of what's happened to SNAP benefits in the sense that obviously huge. I know what was proposed and what you wound up with was better than what could have happened, but do you see any sort of proposals coming down the pipeline that could potentially remedy sort of going to become a huge deficit in funding for these kinds of programs and create greater burden on food insecure households around the country to figure out how they're going to make ends meet? Because, once something's been cut, it's much harder to kind of get it back in. But do you see the next Farm Bill that's coming back or some other kind of policy out there that's going to address the financial piece of this?
Well, you're very accurate in your assessment of how serious this is and how deep the cuts were originally proposed. And, again, it was one of those places where we all said, well, it was better than they proposed. But any cut to the SNAP benefits program, especially in a difficult economy when a lot of people are at work, for the most part really has a huge impact on seniors and children. A lot of kids go hungry in our country, and it shouldn't be that way. We're in a very defensive posture right now. I don't see this Congress, like I said, everything isn't a partisan issue. This is very ideologically driven, and we have Republican control of the House and the Senate. So I see in this year's budgeting process a big likelihood that they will want to make deeper cuts. And, I think we'll put up a big fight, and people will have to make sure they make the case in their home district. Some of the best advocates these days for not cutting SNAP have been the people who run the food banks, churches and not-for-profits, and community activists who are, really struggling to feed all the hungry people, and they struggle even more when you cut people's SNAP benefits. You just have that many more people, so many of whom go to work every day, so many of whom show up in a suit, to get their weekly allotment of food from the food bank, just because it's been a struggle. But here's hoping the job situation is improving, the economy is improving a little, costs less to drive to work right now. I mean, if some of these things improve, the pressure will actually, fall off a little bit on the program, and maybe, there will be some hope in that. So, one more question. Do you have a question, and I'll wrap it up?
Yeah, just a sort of a broad, big question, if you don't mind. We've talked a lot about the Farm Bill, which I guess has served as sort of a de facto food policy for this country for a number of years. Recently, an open letter was written by Michael Pollan and Mark Bittman about advocating the formation of a national food policy. Looking down the road, what are your thoughts about that? And
it's a really good question, and it's a good way to wrap up. And I'm very friendly and close with the people who wrote the letter, and we spent a lot of time sharing our thoughts about food policy. So we immediately signed on as advocates of the letter and have encouraged our colleagues to do the same, and are looking for other ways to promote this idea of really just a bigger food policy. If you haven't read it, it's a great, just sort of statement of what an ideal system could look like, how we need to change these things, but how we could go about doing it. And I think we're in a defensive posture in this particular round, but another farm bill will come up, and, in a couple of years we'll start working on that. But perhaps more importantly, we have a much bigger election coming up in 2016. And again, it doesn't matter which side you're on or who you're going to line up behind, but making food and the idea of our food policy and many of the things that they brought up in their letter and all the things we're talking about today, making that an issue in a presidential campaign has really rarely been done. And I applaud all the organizations that are thinking about how to go about doing that. And I think it could make a big difference interjecting that conversation. And I'm hoping that some of the agricultural agents advocacy group, there's a new group called Food Policy Action that actually now has a scorecard on us members of Congress, and it's one of the first times people have really gotten to see our voting record on these, disparate issues that you don't always know if you're a casual outsider and not a, in the weeds kind of person. You don't always know how these impact all these things we're talking about today. But it's going to be groups like that and other advocacy groups that just say, this is going to be on my plate. And when the presidential candidates come to New Hampshire, or when there's a debate in this place or somewhere else, we're going to raise these questions. And maybe someday we'll have a presidential debate that is just about food and environmental and hunger policy. And, the whole country will get to watch a lot of things that we do, that aren't transparent, that are behind the scenes and that we don't know enough about. But on the other hand, people care deeply about. So we just need a little marriage of those two things, and I think we can make great change. So again, thank you very much for having me here today. It's been a really interesting conference, and I look forward to working with any of you on any of these important issues. So thank you very much.
We're okay.
Maybe just, yeah, I've run into questions, I guess.
All right, hello everyone. Welcome to our third panel of the day. This one is on distribution channels, and our moderator is going to explain a lot more about what that means and some of the questions we'll be asking. So I'm going to just give brief introductions of each of our speakers. Our moderator today is Professor Daniel Vermeer at the Fuqua School, and then also jointly appointed, I believe, at the Nicholas School. And Professor Vermeer is the Executive Director of the Center for Energy Development and the Global Environment. He's a board member of the Duke Campus Farm, and he also serves on Duke's Food Sustainability Committee. He has extensive expertise in sustainable agriculture and in developing sustainable distribution and supply channels for businesses. And in particular, prior to joining Duke, he launched Coca-Cola's Sustainable Agriculture Program and led their Sustainable Value Chain Initiative. And since then, he has continued to play a leading role in advocating for business sustainability. Our speakers are, we have Professor Laurie Ristino from Vermont Law School, who currently is the director of Vermont's Center for Agriculture and Food Systems and previously served as senior counsel at USDA, where she advised on various issues of environmental and natural resources law, including the implementation of the 2002 and 2008 Farm Bills and the run-up to the 2014 bill. And in particular, she's an expert on the bill's conservation title. Second, we have Professor Dara Bloom from NC State University, where she specializes in local foods and is currently developing an integrated research and extension program with a focus on supply chain perspective and using that to address the challenges of strengthening local food systems and increasing consumer access to local foods. Prior to this, and I believe still, Professor Bloom has conducted extensive research on the challenges faced by Walmart's local produce sourcing program and the complexities of that project. And then last, but certainly not least, and very dear to DELPF's heart, we have Professor Michelle Nowlin, who 25 years ago founded DELPF at Duke Law School. Professor Nowlin now teaches our food law course here and is also the supervising attorney and a senior lecturing fellow for the Duke Environmental Law and Policy Clinic. And then prior to joining Duke, but after founding DELPF, Professor Nowlin was a senior attorney with the Southern Environmental Law Center, where among many cases she led SCLC's hog industry project and helped develop a comprehensive regulatory program for CAFOs. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Vermeer to introduce the topic and get us started.
Thanks, Gordon, and good to be here, and I'm very excited about the conversation that we can have today. We just met out in the hall, and our conversation already began to build momentum, so I'm anxious to bring that into the room here today and to engage all of you in that conversation as well. I know all of you now have that comfort food working on you and relaxing into that 2 to 3 kind of swoon. So we're going to try to keep the energy high enough to keep you awake. And if we don't, please somebody, put your hand up and insert some energy into the conversation. We want to have this to be as conversational and interactive as possible, and we'll make time at the end of the session for your questions. But let's kick this conversation off. Obviously, the issues that we're dealing with today. There is a long litany of pathologies of the current food system, which we're all very aware of. Those range from the impacts on health, the phenomenon of obesity, malnutrition, food safety, environmental impacts. It's a long, systemic set of challenges that the food system that we currently have, that we're facing. And I guess the irony is that we all working in this field know of many, many, many better alternatives that are out there. Better foods, better meat, better produce, better systems coming from farmers working in our local communities. We know those alternatives are out there. And the challenge for most of them is how do we get those better products to the market, and how do we achieve profitable scale? We have two kind of systems that coexist. One is a local system with these kind of flourishing alternatives that are operating certainly in this region and in many parts of the country. At the same time, that's embedded in a food system which is global, which is industrial, large scale, and that those two systems sort of determine what people's options are. The better alternatives in many cases are hard for people to find, to be able to afford, to be able to get those alternatives actually into the marketplace. And one of the primary bottlenecks is the distribution system. So today's panel is to focus on that aspect of the food system. How does food get distributed from the farm out to its consumers? What's the current kind of barriers and challenges that we face in moving food through the distribution system, and what are the alternatives that we can begin to work on from a policy perspective, from an infrastructure perspective, from a market perspective that can begin to create more access and availability of these options in the marketplace. So our discussion today will start out very high level, looking at the nature of the food distribution system. This is maybe not something that all of us have a framework for understanding. We want to understand what its current capabilities and limitations are, explore some of the new entrants into the market. Specifically, we'll look at some case studies around local meat as well as around produce. And identify strategies to increase access to better food. We'll also investigate the role of different players in this system, the impact of policies to inhibit or enable the evolution of that food system. So with that, I'd like to kick off the conversation today and turn it over to Laurie to give us a kind of framework for thinking about the distribution system as it currently exists in the U.S. Laurie, can you give us a view of how does the food distribution system actually work?
Sure. And first, let me say that I'm really thrilled to be here, and I appreciate the invitation today. When we think about distribution, sometimes we probably don't because it just happens around us. We have really an enormous, sophisticated distribution system in this country, but it is really important. And what happens when we don't have it is a striking moment. And if we think about what happened, say, in Hurricane Katrina down in New Orleans, the people who were still stuck in the city. A lot of them were lower income folks. Some of those people didn't eat or drink, actually, fresh water for 3 to 5 days. And part of the reason why, besides FEMA's ultimate disaster and getting geared up to really help out, was the fact that the distribution system had ceased to work there. Almost all the exits and entrance into the city had been blocked off. And so when we think about distribution, it can often seem prosaic or boring, but when you don't have it, it's a disaster. Distribution is fundamental to our food system, both in the United States, but also globally. We are deeply embedded and connected to the global food system. Distribution is a fundamental aspect of food security, especially for developing nations as well. It can be a primary cause of famine. So when you think about distribution, think about its real fundamental role in our food system. And so when we talk about changing our food system, making it more sustainable, or hopefully there's a better word someday we'll come up with there, we have to really think about distribution. So how did we get our current distribution system? It really is a function of how agriculture and our food system developed over the last century, which you probably know the broad outlines of that. It became more concentrated, economies of scale took over, it became more mechanized. We really relied upon transporting foodstuffs great distances, first through the railway system and steamships and stuff like that. And then, of course, we developed the federal highway system. And really, I think that distribution started taking off in the middle part of the last century. One good example of that in a distribution company that probably everybody's seen, but you probably don't even think about it, is Cisco. Cisco is a food service distributor, which means they largely distribute to organizations and institutions, and they are the largest in the country, and they possibly may be the largest in the world. In fact, last year they made a bid to buy U.S. Foods, which is the second largest distributor, and now the SEC is looking at that because of its potential monopolistic implications. And that will tell you, though, too, how important distribution is to the well-being of Americans, because if the SEC is looking at that, you can be sure that just like the sale of Smithfield Foods as a national security matter, those are fundamentally important issues. So Cisco's a good example. They actually started off as a mom and pop operation in Texas, and to actually deliver refrigerated foodstuffs to restaurants, because the guy who started the company noticed that they needed to have people doing that. And so he really took an entrepreneurial moment, and then eventually what they kept on doing was buying other businesses until finally, by the end of the last century, they became really enormous, and they are the company that you guys see today with the big trucks with the blue lettering. Even though they're huge, actually, a lot of the distribution system in America is largely fragmented. So we do have national distributors, and we have regional distributors and local distributors. And within those, without getting too boring, there can be specialty distributors, like, for example, organics. There are actually distributors that just deal with organics. Beverage distribution in this country, especially alcohol distribution, is its own animal with its own licensing requirements. So there's a lot of stratification in the market. It's really sophisticated. It's big money in this country. The major players when we talk about food distribution in this country are food brokers. They actually help manufacturers or food growers to match up their product with distributors and to break into new markets. And then, as I noted before, there's just general food distributors. There's also something called food redistributors. That's a new growing segment of the market. There's the largest food redistributor is actually based in the mid part of the country. They're called DOT. I don't know if you've ever heard of them. And they try to gain better economies by selling less than truckloads. So they allow smaller retailers to get into the business. And then And then, as I noted, there's also the specialty distributors as well. So that's kind of the deal. It is this really large, often invisible system that you don't see, and you don't really realize that it's working until it doesn't, and then it's too late generally.
Good. Well, thanks, Laurie. I think getting a sense of the complexity, the diversity at all levels of the system is critical for understanding, and I guess raising the prospect that this isn't kind of a dull academic topic, but one that we all have a huge stake in. Michelle, I'd like to ask you to give us a little bit more granularity around the meat production and distribution system, the current state of the system, and what new alternatives are emerging there.
And I would also like to take a little moment to just thank DELPF for organizing this excellent conference and bringing in people from all over the country to talk about this important issue here in North Carolina. And I think it's also significant that an environmental law and policy journal has organized a conference around food and food systems. For too long, the environmental community has really ignored agriculture and actually been seen as an antagonist towards agricultural production. And I think that that's a really unfortunate development because when you think about land use across the United States, half of our land is in agricultural production. It is the single biggest class of land use with a tremendous impact on the environment and also, very intimately reliant on the quality of that environment. And so I don't think we can continue to ignore that intersection, and for that reason in particular, I'm really glad that this conference is taking place. And of course, the environmental issues are what brings me to the table to talk about this to begin with. And so my focus on these issues is much less from an academic and scholarly perspective and more from an applied perspective. I practice here in a live client clinic, and we represent a number of different sustainable agricultural entities. And I've been looking into the meat distribution system on behalf of an organization called the National Young Farmers Coalition. It's an organization that has formed around the need to transition the United States farming system from an older generation of farmers. The average age is somewhere, depending on what source you're looking at, between 60, 65 years old. And so we need to be transitioning farm ownership and operation to a much younger generation of individuals. That's complicated by the fact that farm families their children are not necessarily wanting to remain on the farm anymore. And so you have barriers to entry right there, and that you may have a young generation of individuals who are interested in going into farming, but they lack land. They lack the technical know-how and the relationships to be able to engage in that productively. And so groups like National Young Farmers Coalition are coming together to try to figure out how to facilitate and support that growing segment of the agricultural economy, to identify and remove barriers and to develop policy instruments that will facilitate that transition. And so that, again, is the perspective that I'm approaching this issue. And I think that when we talk about the consolidation and concentration of the industry, perhaps people are more familiar with this phenomenon than I was when I started doing this type of work. But I still think that we have lost concept of what that actually means in practice. And so I want to give some metrics to explain a little bit about what I'm talking about. So when we're talking about concentration in meat production, if you're looking at stocking densities on a land, what the assimilative capacity is of that land for incorporating the nutrients in the manure stream, being able to produce food to support those animals. If you're looking at hogs in particular, you're looking at stocking densities of maybe 10 animals per acre to make sure that the land is able to rest, that you're not having significant levels of erosion. And if you have a 40-acre farm, you're not going to be stocking all 40 acres with 10 animals per acre. You're going to be making sure that you have sufficient land on that farm to grow the feedstuff that is needed to be able to provide forage and nutrition for those animals. If you take that same 40 acres, though, and you're looking at a concentrated animal feeding operation, you may be able to produce as many as 10,000 market weight hogs on that same area of land. Obviously, the animals are not going around and foraging. They're kept in cages, which represents, some animal welfare concerns, of course, but you also have a much higher concentration of the nutrients, and that farming system is not typically used to produce the feed that is necessary to support the animals within that confinement operation. So you're importing a lot of nutrients, they're staying there, and they're being then dispersed into the environment. And so, yes, that enables you to have, lots of meat at very cheap prices, but that cheapness is really only a register of what you as the consumer are paying at the cash register, and it doesn't really incorporate all of these other costs that are associated with the method of production. In terms of labor standards, in terms of environmental quality, in terms of the quality of life that those that neighbors are now unable to enjoy if they live next door to those facilities. So if there's one thing that I hope that all of you take away from this conference is that this idea of cheap food is a myth. There is no such thing as cheap food. There's only a question of who's bearing the cost of that production. And so I hope that that's something that we can keep in mind far beyond the end of the day today. In terms of distribution, the distribution system that Laurie described is exactly what it is for that large meat business. And I'll take it one step further as a specific example. We have planes flying from North Carolina to Japan, to China, to Korea, to Russia, taking the meat that we are producing here in North Carolina and flying it to other parts around the globe. So what we really have is a global distribution system. And it is supported by a vertically integrated industry. It's not just about the concentration of numbers on individual pieces of land. It's also about the consolidation and vertical integration of that industry as a whole. When I worked at the Southern Environmental Law Center, the joke that we used to say was, that it's all the same company from the corn to the bacon. And that's exactly the way it is. You have those companies like Smithfield that own the grain production, so they're able to avail themselves of the subsidies that go into that grain production, and then that subsidizes the cost of production for the animals that they own in ways that smaller producers are unable to access. They own the animals themselves. They own the genetic material, the patents on that form of life. So that it's designed to be raised under the conditions here and produce a certain type of meat and meat quality that is proprietary to that company. So you have that means of production. They own the buildings. They own, farmers are raising the animals under contract, using proprietary feed stocks that are provided there. The companies own the veterinarians that provide the healthcare services to those animals. Oddly enough, they do not own the waste management systems that the farmers use. So, that's something to think about as well. They own the trucking companies that take the animals, the slaughtered animals, from the processing houses to, the packing facilities and to the retailers, and then they own the labels. And so a lot of the labels that have been acquired and that are now owned by a lot of these companies are those regional brands that your parents, your grandparents know, loved, trusted, and now don't know that they're actually produced in a very different way. So if you're talking about modifying a system, you have a lot there that you need to break down and consider and deal with. And so there's a significant demand as consumers, such as yourselves, become knowledgeable about these impacts, concerned about these impacts. There is a demand for an alternative way of production, for that authenticity that Robert talked about earlier this morning. And the supply is not able to keep pace with that demand. There are lots of people out there who are willing to pay more and pay quite dearly for meats that are produced in ways that are consistent with their values. And as an added benefit, that meat tastes a lot better and is more nutritious. So everybody wins in a system like that. But there are these challenges, as I said, to trying to scale up to be able to provide the demand that is out there within the consumers. And part of that is because as the industry has become so consolidated and so integrated, we've lost the supply chain. And not only have we lost the supply chain, we've lost that basic knowledge of how that supply chain actually works and how to recreate it. And so there's a lot of energy, a lot of effort being put into the process now to figure out how you recreate those relationships, how you rebuild those distribution systems. So one thing that I'd like to mention is that the distribution system for meat products is necessarily more complex than that for your basic fruits and vegetables, because you have an added element, and not only are you just raising the animal, but you also have to have then a separate facility for the slaughtering of that animal, for the disposal of the waste products associated with that slaughter process, and for the cut and wrap facilities and further processing or even value-added processing that meat product requires. So it's a much more complicated system, and that's why I think you see so many more bottlenecks and problems with distribution and recreating the system than you do with fruits and vegetables. We have problems with distance to processing facilities. As the large corporations became more concentrated and more powerful, they bought up a lot of the local regional slaughterhouses and then promptly shut them down or retooled them to serve only that company's own materials, and it's not available to local farmers anymore. So around North Carolina, even though we may have somewhere around 30, 40, maybe even 50, depending on whose numbers you look at, processing facilities, animal processing facilities, there are only about a dozen of those that are actually available to do work with small lot farmers. And so that's a problem that is confronted. In the research that we've been doing, we've talked about with the farmers and about the lack of availability of value-added processing. So even if you are able to get your animal to a processing or a slaughterhouse to be able to break down that animal at a certain level, you don't have access to the cut and wrap facilities, the value-added processing, things like that. Regulatory issues, of course, are also prominent, but they're not in the way that I would have expected. It's more about the inconsistency of the interpretation and application of those regulations by the inspectors that come around. There's a problem with heightened scrutiny of smaller operations simply because the inspectors are able to actually inspect each of those operations or each animal coming through. If it's only slaughtering 100 birds a day, but yet you have a Tyson's plant where they're processing 100,000 birds a day, those inspectors are going to be able to look a lot more closely at those 100 birds than at the 100,000 that are going through. There are other types of things that maybe we'll get a chance to talk about today in terms of the distribution discussion, but I hope that at least gives you some of an introduction of what our clients are dealing with.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, so we'll come back on several of those fronts. Dara, I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about the changing cast of characters in the food space and the food distribution space. I know some of the work that you've done around Walmart and the role that they play is instructive here, that there's mass consolidation in some of the big traditional players that have been in the space a long time, but actually the kind of cast of characters is changing. So could you comment a little bit on that, and in particular, some of the work that you've done on Walmart?
Yeah, definitely. And I'd also want to just take a moment and say thank you for inviting me to be here today. It's an honor to be on this panel and included in the conference. And a lot of my work is really focused on understanding sort of how local food production, specifically produce, comes into conversation with the mainstream conventional food system. So I think it helps to kind of understand a little bit. I mean, obviously, I think we're all aware of sort of this sort of just boom in the interest in local food and the growth in that market in the past decade, say. I don't think we'd all be sitting here today if that weren't true. But a lot of that, when we look at it, has been a lot of direct marketing, especially with produce. So if you look at the statistics, there's just amazing growth in the number of farmers markets, community-supported agriculture, or CSAs. And overall, I mean, if you look statistically, it's just sort of like, it's like a 200% increase or something over the past decade. But if we take sort of the bigger picture, that's still a really small market share. Even if you think about maybe not local, but organic, it's still, I think, maybe like 1 or 2% of the market. So some of these alternative movements, they feel really big. We feel like we're making a lot of progress, but the reality is, in the grand scheme of the food system, they're still really marginal. And something else that's really come up in sort of the study and the practice of local food systems over the past decade is sort of realizing how exclusionary they can be. So they're difficult for low-income consumers, and I hesitate to necessarily say in terms of price, because there are some studies that have shown that local produce, I mean, especially like in the middle of the season, right? So if you want a local tomato in the middle of December, you're going to be paying higher prices. But in the middle of the summer, you might actually be able to find that at a farmer's market market for less money than at a supermarket. So it's not necessarily only an issue of price, but there are a lot of studies that show that farmers markets aren't very accessible for low-income consumers, either because of the day or the time, the fact that they're just held once a week, the fact that they're sort of constructed as spaces of affluence, and that there's a perception that they're not really necessarily as welcoming to maybe a more diverse clientele. There are issues with community-supported agriculture for low-income consumers. For those of you who aren't familiar with CSAs, you've got to pay like a big chunk of that up front, right? And for a reason. I mean, I think a lot of, when Michelle was talking about the externalized costs, the idea is that, we're trying to internalize some of those costs. And so with the CSA, the idea of having a consumer pay up front is that, you're sharing the risk and recognizing the risk that farmers take in producing food. But that's a big barrier for access for low-income consumers. So in terms of local food and sort of where the movement is headed, it started this conversation of, well, how do we get to that broader consumer base, and how do we scale up local food systems? So that's sort of the conversation that we've been having, and a lot of times that means engaging with institutional markets, either farm to school, farm to prison, hospital, trying to engage those markets, and in some cases it has to do with supermarkets, and that's the majority of what I have studied is looking at Walmart's and local produce sourcing program, and I think it's sort of this sort of fascinating moment where you have this confluence of interests, where you have this sort of more grassroots movement that's trying to think about how do you scale up, and then you have these large corporations like Walmart, like Pepsi, like Cisco, that are trying, for various motivations, trying to figure out how they can kind of tap into that more localized market and sort of what that means. And that's, within their context, that's part of like a CSR, corporate social responsibility. It fits into sort of their sustainability interests. A lot of issues too about sort of, a lot of questions of, well, who gets to decide what that's going to look like? Is it going to be a corporation or a government? We can get into that. But when you have sort of the corporate interest from the top and the grassroots interest from the bottom of engaging local agriculture with these mainstream markets, you get some really interesting tensions, I think. So, a big part of the local food movement, if you think of it as sort of a social movement, was about regaining control of the food system. So a lot of it was sort of in reaction to the fact that our food distribution system is so increasingly globalized and corporate dominated. So local food was about sort of trying to regain community control, try to support local economic development, in part too sort of a reaction against the corporate co-optation of organic standards. So when the organic standards were set in 2002, a lot of people were really unhappy with how that played out, and especially in terms of the participation of larger scale corporations in those standards. And so I think, the local food movement in part kind of came out of a reaction against that, and people saying, well, if the organic standards still mean that I can buy, organic from China or California and it's being produced on an industrialized farm, then that no longer means what we were hoping it meant. It no longer captures sort of the social and environmental aspects of why we wanted to have those standards in the first place. And that the idea that it should be local was sort of a reaction against that. And so the participation of a corporation like Walmart in that is sort of, for a lot of people, just anathema to that. Like, wait a second, like Walmart's big. Walmart is the epitomization of big, and so how can that possibly work with local? But other people, tend to see it as an opportunity, right? I mean, it's a huge market. And, again, it gets to this idea of the fact that a lot of what the local food movement has been up till now has been about small scale and direct marketing. But if you look statistically at sort of, farming over the past, few decades, what we've lost is sort of the agriculture of the middle. So we have a lot of really small scale farms doing the direct marketing. We have a handful of really large farms, which is where most of our food comes from. And we used to have these sort of mid-sized family farms who've lost out as we put more pressure on things like efficiency and economies of scale. And so a lot of people see this opportunity of the scaling up and the interest by mainstream actors in local food as this opportunity for that sort of mid-size. But I think that there's some interesting ways that this could go. I mean, I think that there's possible that there's going to be sort of another backlash by consumers against the participation of places like Walmart. Interest in authenticity. What does local actually mean? It doesn't doesn't specify production practices, either socially or environmentally. It's much more about sort of people's perceptions of what they want it to mean. And I guess also just sort of thinking about, so some of my research was looking very specifically at what it looks like for Walmart to actually localize their supply chains or try to scale down and get to that local level. And there are a lot of ways that those don't necessarily match up. So Walmart often ends up buying from really large-scale farms, which are family-owned and operated. I think that's the other interesting thing is, in terms of the rhetoric, we're like, well, we want to support family farms. It's like, well, in North Carolina, some of your family farms are 10,000 acres and go across a few states and are incorporated. They're family-run and operated for many generations. But, that's, I think, maybe sort of our unfamiliarity with the agricultural system sometimes leads us to, not have our expectations met. But so some of the things that I had found in looking at Walmart's attempts to localize was, first of all, they were buying through the really large-scale farms, but that there were reasons for that. And one is, that in terms of sort of how we got to where we are, we have really standardized products and practices. And for Walmart, that's really important. They want you to be able to walk into any Walmart across the country and have it look exactly the same. And they kind of want you to be able to pick up like any apple and be like, they want them all to look the same. But, with local, that's not necessarily true. There's so much diversity, and it's also in terms of sort of centralization too, right? So Walmart is sort of notorious for being a very centralized, hierarchical company, and they want control over how they want to know every store looks exactly the same. And again, local really works better when it's decentralized. If you have a lot of small-scale farmers, what we found working. I also work a little bit with the North Carolina Growing Together project. It's based out of NC State. And they're trying to work with Lowe's here in North Carolina. And one of the things we found is it's really hard to get local food going through a distribution center. It's a lot easier to just have a local farmer deliver to a local store. But then the corporate headquarters loses control over that. You lose a certain amount of quality control. And for somewhere like Walmart, that's a really big deal. So, standardization, centralization, and then this issue of cutting out the middleman, which I think is the most interesting because in local food systems, we often hear, farmers do better because you cut out the middleman. Well, with Walmart, they cut out the middleman in order to put pressure on, manufacturers or producers to drive down prices. So, and in terms of local food, what we find is, if we're trying to get these small-scale producers into larger-scale markets, we need some kind of aggregation and distribution in between. It doesn't make sense for a Walmart to go out and buy from all these tiny little farmers. Like, there needs to be some type of intermediary, some type of middleman. But that, again, goes against sort of what some of those strategies that made Walmart successful in the first place, which was bypass those middlemen and get it straight from the producer so that they could get lower prices. So I think that's some of what I'd seen in my research and how I see sort of the local food system moving.
Great. A couple of you touched on the issue of consumer demand, and obviously you can cite statistics about this kind of, sort of exponential explosion of interest in local food and the number of farmers markets and so forth. It's kind of reminiscent of the energy market where you can cite those same kind of things about solar. But it's from such a small base that you can look 30 or 40 years ahead and say, yes, there's going to be 20% growth year on year, but that's not going to matter for the next 50 years just because it's such a massive system. There's a little bit of a kind of a sense of that here too. Can you speak to how rapid you think the kind of consumer uptake could be, and what are the factors that'll mediate that? Is this something that is only possible when there's affluence, only possible in an up market? We've had a pretty interesting experiment over the last 5 years about how people respond in more challenging economic sort of conditions. But I'm interested to see how you see this market changing and how rapidly the kind of consumer demand for this will grow over time. Anyone want to take that on?
I'd like to just make an initial comment. We're actually experiencing a social movement, and which is what I think makes this a little bit different. It's one that can be squandered. The moment can certainly be squandered, but I think what we have is momentum and people really caring, including millennials as well as more affluent people, but also people who care about social justice and the environment. This is one of those situations where, and why I actually like this discipline that's growing in law schools, because it is it's transdisciplinary, it's also multi-doctrinal, and that's really important. It's a reflection of what's going on out in society. So I see the great potential for growth, but it could be a squandered moment if we're not very thoughtful about how do you grow our food system to be more dynamic. And for me, it's not just a question of local food, because not all local food is better than food that you get from other places. Some places will never produce certain things, and they never should. So it's really complicated and dynamic, and I think what we need to do is have a nuanced discussion, like one of the ones that we're having today, or actually all day long we've been having them, but ensure that we start building them into our legal and policy systems in a way that allow these newer experiments to flourish, and also picking out the experiments that work. So we were just talking out in the hallway about how certain ways of helping out small producers work, and sometimes they don't, like food hubs, which is like a sexy thing that a lot of states are trying out, including Vermont. Some food hubs work well, and they do dynamic things, like they can be a processing facility and a marketing facility and a business planning facility all in one, and they can help small people scale up without getting bigger. Sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. Why do they work sometimes and why don't they? And I think figuring that out and then moving that out into a space where other people can learn from it is really critical in order to get over some of these fundamental systemic hurdles we have in our system, which, by the way, we spent the last 100 years creating, and we are not going to be unraveling it in a day, and to some extent, we're never going to totally unravel conventional food. It's here, but how do we diversify how we get our food in ways that make sense?
Any other thoughts on the consumer question?
Yeah, I think, if you look at some of the market trends, I think that what we're seeing with the local and the more transparent food system is reminiscent of what was happening with the organic system at the beginning. It was growing by, tenfold a year for a very long time. Now, yes, it is a very slim margin of the overall food economy, but there are other forces that look forward towards those trends, because that's the basis of commodity investing, and that's the way that different retail outlets are able to jump on consumer trends and get ahead of the thing. They look at where these little shifts are taking place, and I think you have a snowballing effect. What I think about in terms of, is it just something that is available in a strong economy? No, because we hadn't had a strong economy. This, movement really started maybe in got big and started getting that kind of larger scale momentum, maybe in the mid-2000s. And then we had a market crash that's been very severe and long lasting, yet this trend has continued to develop and escalating in very dramatic ways. So I don't think it's something that just depends on a strong economy. Just in the same way that, maybe people are investing more in their houses, people are starting to invest more in their communities. And that's one of the things that is so attractive here, that you can start to see that people want to stay in smaller towns or in rural areas that have access to urban markets. It's a way of getting those food dollars to stay within a community and to build wealth. And that's something that really does. It's something that people can see. They can see it in terms of, who's buying new clothes or who's buying a new car or who's making improvements to their home. And once you can see that happening down your block and within your community, I think it's something that takes on a life of its own. So I don't expect that it's going to be, this is a flash in the pan that is going to end anytime soon. How you measure that, how big it can actually get, I think that's an unknown right now and depends upon a lot of the policy shifts that, we'll be talking about later.
Good. So I'd like to return us to kind of the heart of the discussion around distribution systems and what are some of the systemic challenges. I think we've identified several of them already in this conversation. There's certain market forces that are at play here that make it challenging to get these kind of products to market. There's infrastructure gaps that are not built for these kinds of systems and then therefore are barriers. There are various policies that are in place or policies that need to be written in order to enable this kind of transformation to happen. I'd like to ask each of you to think about how we might prioritize those. Maybe you can think about, in this array of challenges, where are the ones that are really kind of the fundamental ones that we need to take on, because it's a little daunting to sort of see this whole array of challenges. Where do we start? Where are the ones that can really begin to unlock this? So if I can ask each of you to think about where would you focus attention given this kind of wide portfolio of challenges? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Michelle probably has a lot more to say about this than I do, but I think, we already started to talk a little bit about food hubs and this idea of infrastructure and sort of the, maybe what has been lost as the food system has become so big and sort of globalized, and how we rebuild that. Especially, we were talking earlier about, it's, the food system is working the way it was designed to work. We have placed this emphasis on economies of scale, the efficiencies that are gained, by managing large volumes of food. And when we're trying to talk about local food systems, what ends up happening is we're not really in a level playing field. We're trying to rebuild infrastructure that was lost as part of this process of creating a nationalized and globalized food system. So, it's really hard for those businesses to compete because of that. And I think that's sort of the biggest challenge is how do we revitalize those small to mid-size farms and businesses that are needed to be sort of that backbone and that infrastructure of regional food systems, understanding that they're up against these really large-scale players like a Walmart that can leverage, volume in a way that means that they can offer lower prices. And, just back to the other question about consumer demand, I think survey after survey shows that consumers are very, very interested in local food, in alternative food, and they always, I think, though, as the keynote speaker mentioned, people say that they're willing to pay more, but those willingness to pay studies often, I'm not a behavioral economist, but often, it's like people, when you ask them in a survey, people are like, oh yeah, I'd pay more for that. And when they actually get out in the market, they're not actually going to do that. So I think the challenge is, that we're often, because we're adding these extra steps in the supply chain and we're trying to compete, we have a hard time getting at those low prices, and it's hard to change people's behavior and expectations about what their food should cost.
I'm putting my money on meat. I'm putting it with you, Michelle, because that is so intractable, I've got to say, and it's so destructive to the environment.
Well, one thing, in terms of the distribution aspects and changing the economy there is around this concept of whole animal utilization. Right. And this is something, I have a friend who's started one of the aggregator businesses locally for meat, and she's always talking about whole animal utilization, and I didn't really understand what that meant, other than, okay, so you want to take some of the scraps and you want to make hot dogs or you want to make sausages, but it's really much deeper than that. And so as we've been doing some of the research for the young farmers, we've discovered this whole I don't know what kind of market you would call it, but the secondary market that I didn't know existed in the trade of what's referred to as offal. Not AWFUL, although it might be, it's OFFAL. And so all the inedible parts of the animal. And if you're talking about cows and you're talking about hogs, you're talking about 30 to 50% of the overall carcass weight. If you have a plant, again for context, like Smithfield Foods, that is slaughtering up to 40,000 hogs a day, you're talking about more than 10 million pounds of animal a day, up to 50% of which is inedible. And so that's an awful lot of material that you have to account for. And in the economies of scale, a lot of these large slaughterhouses and processors will actually lose money on the meat processing part because of all the revenue there is to be made off of selling the hides to a tannery. collecting some of the parts that American consumers don't necessarily find very palatable, but are considered delicacies in other parts of the world, and then shipping them over. Taking some of the bones, which aren't edible, but you can be ground into bone meal that can be then used to supplement animal foods and things like that. So there's a tremendous market for all of these things, which small processing facilities really can't take advantage of, because guess what? The offal market is also very consolidated, and there are 4 dominant industry players throughout the United States. They're going to be wanting to do business with those slaughterhouses that can do that kind of large volume business and stay away from smaller facilities. So I think that there's a lot of work that can be done here in figuring out other market players, not just aggregators for the meat products that can take things from a variety of small producers, get them to processing and get them out to retail markets, but also an aggregator of a different kind to take advantage of some of the less palatable or even inedible parts of the animal process itself, to try to start changing the economy and the calculation that smaller producers go into.
Good. Laurie, thoughts on where to focus?
Like I said, I think the animal part is really is tremendously difficult because you do have those economies of scale there. And I think we have externalized the cost of meat production and protein production in this country so tremendously that it is difficult to kind of scale that back and make small producers really profitable. In Vermont, what we see is people really do need to have that relationship and have the farm individual branding to get that value added, so that people are willing to pay that extra. And we do, because we do have quite a few cooperatives and other kinds of ventures that have sprung up to really help local food. We do see small time producers of beef and pork and also poultry make it in the Northeast, but I think it's because they've been at it for a bit, and we do have things like food hubs and food venture centers, as well as restaurants and purveyors, and actually small local distribution companies like Black River Produce is a well-known place, and they're actually now branching into meats, and they serve the upper New England. But that really took a lot of time to put into place. And I think the other thing is people have to be willing to spend more, and they're just not, like, I'm willing, and I can do that. I can spend more for my beef, but it does cost more when you get it locally and when you know your producer, because the real cost of producing that meat is really built into that that product more. And I have to say too, I think that part of the solution here is eating less meat protein, not only in this country but globally. And this is going to be an enormous issue internationally when the Asian populations continue to grow by 2050, and Africa as well, and there's more demand for meat. I can't see the globe being able to support the kind of industrialized meat production that the growing demand will seem to require.
Laurie, just to comment on that, my wife's family is from India, and we were in India 10 years ago for a Christmas holiday, and the meal came out, and there were 5 vegetable dishes, and there was a meat. And then we were back a couple of years ago at the same time of year, and it was the same kind of celebratory meal, and they brought the food out, and it was 5 different dishes of meats and a vegetable. And so just in that less than 10 years, there was this dramatic transformation in what it meant to celebrate in India. And you just sort of do the math on what that kind of explosion in meat consumption means. It's clear that that's a huge challenge in this space. So
it's a symbol of a growing middle class, and it's hard
exactly.
to do that societally.
That's right. So it's personal taste, and it also is symbolic. It means that you've arrived, that you're able to afford that. It's also interesting to note that as people kind of walk that ladder, the explosion in the oils that come, after the kind of the pure vegetarian diets, but before they're getting to meat consumption, you see the kind of palm oil and peanut oil and all these different kind of oil consumption in these markets also explode. So that's I think the systemic kind of backdrop to a lot of these issues. I'd like to focus some attention on what solutions you see emerging in this space, and what do you see as exciting sort of innovations that could be part of the answer to these questions. Obviously, huge challenges we've identified here, but Michelle, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about the kind of the process improvements or the technologies that are being brought to bear in addressing some of these challenges.
So in the meat market, one of the things that smaller processors are talking about, that they sometimes have difficulty with is scheduling and how to make sure that they have that consistent throughput throughout the year, because meat production, similar to produce, is somewhat seasonal. There are demands for certain types of products at certain types of years, so you might have a tremendous push to, process a huge batch of turkeys, for example, going up to Thanksgiving. Why is nobody eating any turkey in April? I'd like to know. So you have some difficulties with things like that with scheduling. And, there are a lot of the smaller farmers, more traditional farmers, smaller processors are not automated. They do not have the types of technologies that the larger plants and the more sophisticated participants in the marketplace have access to. And so there's a need right now to really develop some of the scale-appropriate scheduling software. So there's a company out of Pennsylvania, a meat processor out of Pennsylvania called Smucker's Meats, that has developed a scheduling system called MeatWorks that NC Choices, a wonderful program here in North Carolina, is now looking at trying to purchase and put into operation on some of the small-scale slaughterhouses here. So having something as very basic like that it's a cloud-based system where farmers can see it, they can use it, they can say, oh, there's an opening here, so I think I'll take advantage of that. There's, you can have a queue, a wait list, so that if you have a last-minute cancellation, there's somebody else who immediately can move up into that chain and make sure that the slaughterhouse then doesn't just have an unexpected down day where they're, losing business, losing money in the production process, and somebody else then can occupy that space. So those things are, they're fairly technical, and they're not intuitive. It's not the type of thing that you would think would be something that was difficult for a business to organize. But that type of scheduling is very important, and I think that's really exciting that you're having computer programmers look at this, understand the business, work together with those processors, and come up with solutions that are size appropriate for that. You're also seeing a thing that I think is very exciting and perhaps extends beyond meat production, changes in land use restrictions and land use patterns around meat production to facilitate broader agricultural production even in smaller scales. And so you see that in terms of tax reforms so that farms can be taxed based on what they're actually doing as opposed to the highest market value that land might be able to convey. So you're seeing that effort to try to lower tax burdens is, I think, very helpful. Having land reforms that authorize small lot chicken production, perhaps, in suburban areas or even in urban areas. Having the advent of community gardens, things that really more democratize the food system as a whole, I think are very exciting. And one of the things I love about living here in Durham is that we seem to be on the vanguard of doing a lot of those types of things. And then, of course, there are the emergence of all these different networks and collaborations bringing people together. I've mentioned NC Choices and the Carolina Farm Stewardship Association here, but there are comparable organizations in Vermont, out in the Pacific Northwest and other areas of the Northeast. And so looking at that type of effort to really bring people together, I think, is also very exciting and is going to help contribute to the transition here.
I'd like to add to that. In Vermont, we have something called Farm to Plate, and that's really about scaling up social change by connecting people. It's exactly what you were talking about. And what they've essentially done is they've mapped everybody who's involved in food, every organization in the state, and there's an annual gathering where we get together and talk about that. And it really is a way to try to actually create collective impact through the individual actions of all all those organizations. So that's really exciting. One of the things that I see happening in the food movement right now, and people sometimes say to me, like, what does the law have to do with any of the stuff that you're talking about or we're talking about today? And I would say everything. And in fact, food entrepreneurism and business law, especially socially responsible business law, plays such an enormous role in the food movement right now. When you talk about creating new food structures or new ways to distribute and to connect people to product, I see a lot of businesses actually emerging, and there's a lot of venture capital that's actually going into food production, value-added production, and food distribution. Some examples of that are Farmigo out of Brooklyn, Good Eggs out of San Francisco, and they just expanded into New Orleans. They connect food producers and farmers to consumers. And there was one other that I wanted to mention. Now it's slipped out of my brain. But anyway, but there's a whole group of organizations that are doing that, and it's really exciting. And they're developing different business models to recreate or to create anew the kind of structures that really support local or more sustainable foodways.
Go ahead, Dara.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add too, I sort of, echo all of those. And I would say that, I think sometimes when we stop and want to find solutions, that there's this, it's very tempting to have sort of like a one-size-fits-all solution. But I think that there's sort of a movement to create food policy councils in local communities. And I think that, realizing that a lot of these issues are going to be contextual and that it really is about sort of having communities take control and think about, what they can actually do to meet the very specific needs of their community is really exciting. And here in North Carolina, I work a lot with the Center for Environmental Farming Systems, which is CEFS, which is works with NC Choices as part of that. And they also have another project called Community Food Strategies, and it's a collaboration with the Carolina Farm Stewardship Association. And they've been trying to work with communities to facilitate food policy councils. They're working in 40 out of the 100 counties that we have in North Carolina just within the past year. And it's really just about facilitating those relationships. And I mean, what's exciting about food too is that there's so many different stakeholders from different sectors who are interested. So, public health, as all of a sudden there's all this interest from the public health sector in food systems. And it's really about sort of bringing all of these different people from different sectors to the table, and people who know their community and know the food system and the needs of the people in their community. And I'm really excited to see what kind of solutions they come up with, rather than sort of having us sort of sit here and be like, well, what can we do to kind of fill in those gaps? So I think that's something to really see kind of what comes out of that.
There's one other thing that I would like to mention that Dara reminded me of, and that is the increasing involvement of cooperative extension and land-grant universities in this conversation, because for so long the land-grant universities were really oriented more towards providing that kind of technical assistance to the large-scale growers and industrial participants, and not really, kind of forgetting who their base was. And I think that what we're seeing now is very exciting, and that you have cooperative extension doing a lot of outreach, technical training, video training for farmers, facilitating conversations between farmers and processors, and between farmers and restaurateurs or retail outlets, so that there's more of an understanding about what the system actually wants, who needs what kind of production methods, what types of certifications or product quality consumers are demanding, and really trying to bring back that conversation to all the different participants in the chain. And cooperative extension, I don't know what it is like in other states, but in North Carolina in particular, I think it's just really doing phenomenal things to help support the revitalization of this sector of the economy.
That's great. I'd like to just return a little bit to the issue that you brought up, Laurie, which is around financing in this space. And, traditional sources of finance are also calibrated to large-scale industrial kind of models. And you mentioned some of the venture capital and kind of the social entrepreneurship kinds of funding that are going in. I'm interested if either of you see kind of how capital is moving into this space, whether it's at the scale that it needs to be, what are the sources, what are the kind of the right size of kind of investment, and the right model of investment to help to accelerate these efforts.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what we're seeing are, grants from either the USDA or, large NGOs. And I'm really interested actually in this issue of the social entrepreneurship, because I think we walk this really fine line, I mean, where you need the startup capital from these grants, but then there's also that risk of becoming dependent on the grant funding and not becoming sort of a viable business. And also I think it's really hard. I mean, we talk about social entrepreneurship, but, the reality is that social enterprises walk a really fine line. Like, it's really hard to embed social values into economic transactions. Economic priorities sort of tend to win out. It's a very hard venture. And I went to the Food Hub conference that was hosted last year here in Raleigh, and one of the big conversations too is if some food hubs are nonprofits and others are incorporated, is it fair for some of those to be receiving grants, in terms of competition in a marketplace? And so there's a lot of questions as we're trying to think about using grant funds to, start and maintain businesses, about, how these businesses are operating in the marketplace, how they're maintained, and that question too of, if we can't prove that they're viable economic, businesses, are we going to be able to get venture capitalists to invest in them, which we need really to kind of, bolster that sector?
There is a difference, though, I think, with this movement in that we are seeing money come in, and it also kind of parallels the slow money movement, the slow money and the slow food movement, which is really kind of interesting. They just started a Vermont slow money chapter in Vermont. And one of the principals who started that, he's actually he runs something called the Clean Yield Fund, which is a fund for socially responsible investors, largely family foundations that want to support small companies and socially responsible companies. They don't necessarily need to get a huge return, but they do want some return. And I see more philanthropies as doing that as a way of getting return, but supporting the kind of businesses that they think are making a difference. So concurrent with the food movement is this kind of progressive financing movement that's occurring that's really interesting and really fascinating. So we're seeing, and also different ways of raising capital too that are slightly unusual, like High Mowing Seeds in Vermont did their own raising of capital, and then they had this payback. They would pay back over time their investors, and the way he structured it, he's a really smart guy, Tom Stearns, he actually did pay everybody back, but he did it in such a way that was extremely creative. So there's a lot going on out there on the capital front as well, which also involves, again, lawyers. So law does play into this in many different creative ways. So if you do want to be a business lawyer, there's actually good things you can do with that degree.
In the meat space, there's been this conversation that's been taking place in different areas, whether you want to invest in a new plant or whether you want to invest in an existing facility that may have the capacity to expand. Maybe it's just adding an additional cut and wrap facility. Maybe it's something as small as adding a particular type of packaging that retailers are interested in having or farmers are interested in having. And all of that requires a lot of capital that is not necessarily available through conventional means. And if it is available, it's only available at very high interest rates. And so you're seeing a lot of very creative responses here in terms of crowdsourcing, crowdfunding. There are examples of situations in which farmers decide that they really want to make a deeper commitment and have that kind of access, so they themselves will make an investment, and it's different from a co-op structure. They're just making that investment so that they can further facilitate that partnership and have a reliable outlet and high-quality processing for their materials. And then you have, locally, we have a group, the Self-Help Credit Union, that is actually has a sustainability arm and a few folks who are looking at food systems. Where are the points in the distribution and production system that require capital? Who are the people who are doing that, and how can we make favorable lending terms for them so that they're able to do this, pay back, because we do need to be paid back for these things, but be a part of the conversation and the revitalization of these economies. And then there's some more creative funding mechanisms that we're starting to see coming through different Farm Bill programs. And so some of it may be in cooperation with with the Department of Health and Human Services, trying to do the double SNAP benefits, for example, so that you get more money going into the farmer's hands so that they're able to make that kind of investment. There's this healthy food financing program in the 2014 Farm Bill that I think somebody this morning may have mentioned. That's a combination of DHHS, Treasury, and USDA that provides incentives for location of certain facilities and retail outlets in low-income communities. So you're seeing a lot of creativity trying to make sure that there is more access, that there is farmers are getting paid for the materials, processors are getting paid, and having to do that outside of your conventional financing mechanisms.
Good. So I'm going to take Laurie's kind of manifesto, a call to the lawyers, that we need lawyers in this space, and ask for your questions. This is your chance to tap the brains of these folks. I think we put a lot of content on the table, but I'm sure there's other issues or questions that are on your mind that we could go deeper.